The Viking Age circa 793–1066 AD eco, unsided with the early stages of the medieval warm period. Yet the Nordic climate remained severe, with howling gales that roared like 1,000 angry gods, hammering sleet and ice against the wooden walls of longhouses. Outside, the landscape vanished into a blizzard that felt eternal lay white, roaring void where direction, color, and hope dissolved. Inside, 40 souls huddled in darkness, breathing the same thick air. The only light came from a central hearth, its flames flickering like the world's last heartbeat. A child whimpered from hunger. An elder coughed, throat and eyes burning from smoke. The rafters were blackened with soot. The air tasted of ash, wool, and fear. Beyond the door, the world was locked in ice -30 degrees Celsius and falling. Her sunrise had not been seen for weeks. The sun merely grazed the horizon in a teasing instant before abandoning the land to darkness once more. This was not the end of the world. It was just another ordinary Tuesday in Viking age Scandinavia. Did you survive 6 months in such an environment? Most modern people, spoiled by central heating, electric lights, and supermarkets offering strawberries in winter, would likely not last a week. Yet, for nearly 3 centuries between 800 and 1100 AD, the Norse people not only endured these conditions, they thrived within them. They built a civilization stretching from the Arctic Circle to North America, forging amidst cold darkness and scarcity one of the most formidable cultures in human history. But Vikings were not gods or monsters. They were flesh, bone, and will. Ordinary people who woke each morning to a world that seemed intent on killing them. Their extraordinary nature lay not in their strength per se, but in their relationship with suffering. They did not merely resist hardship, they shaped it into the core of their identity. Each generation was trained by the last in the ancient art of endurance. Children learned it early. Pain was information, not tragedy. Adults were measured not by wealth or beauty, but by how much cold they could bear without complaint. The North itself became their teacher, a deity demanding all obedience and sacrifice in exchange for survival. What happens when a people see winter not as a season, but as a religion? So archaeologists and climatologists now know the Viking world was forged during one of Earth's harshest periods. Greenland ice cores reveal evidence of repeated micro-ice ages, times when volcanic ash blotted out the sun, freezing growing seasons. Crops failed utterly. Livestock died in their stalls. Families were swallowed by snowdrifts that never melted. It was in this crucible that the Norse carved out their fate. While the rest of Europe shivered behind stone walls, the people of the North learned to turn adversity into art. Their myths, their architecture, even their spiritual beliefs were answers to the same relentless question. How do you keep living when nature itself wants you dead? The answer did not begin on battlefields or long ships, but here, in the suffocating dark of winter. For the Vikings, survival was not a passive state. It was an act of creation. They invented ways to outsmart hunger, trap heat, and sustain hope through months without sunlight. They built communities that turned endurance into meaning and meaning into strength. The question is not only how they survived, but what they became because of it. To understand the Vikings, you must step into their darkness. Step into a world where death was often only a few heartbeats away. Where the line between courage and despair blurred with each passing night. This is the story of how they endured when everything in nature conspired to destroy them, and what their survival reveals about the limits and power of the human spirit. The darkness arrived first, long before hunger, before the cold bit to the bone. The sun itself disappeared. In northern Scandinavia, by late October, daylight was a ghost. Sunrise became a taunt to those still waiting for warmth. Each day, the horizon would glow a few hours with a dark red light, like an open wound, before sinking back into endless night. Imagine waking to no sun, not for a day, not for a week, but for months. By December, the world around Trondheim and the Lofoten Islands had no daylight at all. The sun did not rise. It merely remembered rising. The land existed in the half-sleep of perpetual twilight. a world where the human mind began to confuse time itself. Wrapped in the comforts of electric light, modern people cannot truly imagine the effect on the brain. In the Viking world, darkness was not a mood. It was a weapon. It crept into the mind, pressing on the skull like a weight, whispering doubt and madness. Winter is coming. For the Norse, this was not a warning, it was a prophecy. Everyone knew it arrived earlier than hoped and lingered longer than could be borne. The entire year was a countdown to the slow motion disaster. Months of hard labor were not for progress, but for preparation for survival. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia confirm the scale of this annual war with nature. At Borg, in the Lofoten Islands, massive underground storage pits have been found, vaults capable of holding half a year's supplies. These were not signs of prosperity. They were monuments to fear. Every plank of wood, every dried fish, every grain of barley stored in those pits was an act of defiance against extinction. The Vikings were not planning for winter. They were planning for catastrophe, and catastrophe often came. Climate records preserved in Greenland's ice caps show brutal fluctuations, so minus called micro-ice ages. The most infamous occurred around 8536, when a curtain of volcanic ash dimmed the sun for nearly 2 years. Crops failed across Europe. Forests withered. People starved under ashen skies. And Norse would later call this the Fimbul winter, the mighty winter that heralded Ragnarok, the end of all things. By the time the Viking Age truly began around AD 800, that ancestral memory still haunted them. Coastal Norwegian temperatures hovered around -10 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Fahrenheit on a good day, plunging to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit during cold snaps. Inland Sweden and Norway regularly fell to -40 degrees Celsius, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was so vicious that breath crystallized mid-air, and unprotected flesh died within minutes. But cold alone did not make the north uninhabitable. It was the combination of enemies' darkness, wind, hunger, isolation that turned the Viking homelands into a proving ground designed by the gods themselves. The sea, their usual highway for trade and war, betrayed them each year. They scrapped from the coasts like invading armies, strangling fjords and freezing ships in place. Excavations of coastal settlements show layers of abandonment. Entire villages simply gave up when the sea froze too far out. Snow was another siege. Drifts rose higher than roofs, swallowing paths and fences. At Burka, in Sweden, archaeologists have found the remains of trenches as tall as a man, corridors hacked through walls of snow higher than people. Imagine each trip for water or firewood becoming a march through a frozen tunnel. The wind compounded everything. Fjords funneled gales that could strip skin from a face. Winter storms were not poetic exaggerations. They were acts of destruction. The sagas describe winds that could rip the roofs off hulls and swallow whole ships. Meteorologists now know they were right. North Atlantic low-pressure systems, even today, can produce hurricane-force gusts and waves 20 meters high. And the worst enemy remains scarcity. Soil analysis in pollen date reveal Viking agriculture was forever on the edge of collapse. One short summer or failed harvest meant famine. In human skeletons from the period, scientists find Harris lines. Here are the rest lines caused by severe malnutrition. These lines appear again and again, year after year of winter, even in well-fed communities. Every Viking carried winter inside their bones. Forests that once fed their fires became inaccessible. Rivers froze solid, locking trade and travel. Even the earth itself turned to iron. They could not dig graves for their dead. Bodies had to be stored in barns or sheds until spring, likely a typo for spring or Thor returned. Death did not vanish in winter. It lingered frozen, staring back at the living. And yet, somehow, the Norse did not merely survive this environment. They embraced it. Winter became the rhythm of their culture. Feast and famine, darkness and rebirth, silence and song. In the long confinement, they forged the psychological steel they would later carry across oceans. To understand their strength, you must understand their darkness. Winter was not a pause between seasons. It was a season the crucible that determined who lived and who died. And at the heart of that crucible stood humanity's greatest invention against the cold, the Viking longhouse, a furnace of flesh, flame, and faith, where the human species was engineered for endurance. A wooden door groans open, spilling a blade of white light into the blackness. For a moment, the outside world intrudes a blizzard, snow and wind howling like a living thing. Then the door slams shut, sealed with clay and moss, and the storm becomes a memory. Inside, 40 people and a few animals breathe the same heavy air. The longhouse creaks as if alive, its timbers bending under the weight of ice and snow. Smoke from the hearth curls upward into the rafters, making the air thick and dim. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a survival engine. Here, humans and animals shared warmth, breath, and fate. Its structure itself was a masterpiece of adaptation, a weapon built against the cold, refined through generations of trial, death, and necessity. Excavations across Scandinavia from Iceland to Norway to Denmark reveal a stunning truth. Every beam, every wall of these halls was engineered not for beauty, but for endurance. At Borg in the Lofoten stands the site of the largest Viking longhouse ever unearthed, over 80 meters long, built like the spine of a whale. Its curved walls were not just for elegance. They were a battle with the wind, deflecting it upward and outward. Its elongated body minimized exposed surface area, trapping as much heat as possible. Long before modern architects talked of thermal efficiency, Viking builders were its masters. Every plank was a calculation, every shape a line of defense against death. At the heart of the longhouse burned the long fire. It was not just a fireplace. It was the soul of the house, the line of light dividing warmth from oblivion. The hearth was deliberately low, letting heat spread slowly, wrapping the room like a blanket. Smoke didn't escape easily. It lingered beneath the roof beams, forming what archaeologists now call the smoke ceiling layer. That layer of smoke trapped warmth, preserved meat hanging from hooks, and killed parasites that might infest the thatch. The price of this ingenious design: constant coughing, streaming eyes, and lungs blackened by soot. Human skeletons found in Norse graves tell this story. Their ribs show signs of chronic respiratory strain. Their sockets revealed damage from smoke irritation. Yet, they willingly endured it because that same smoke was the barrier between life and frostbite. The walls of these halls were equally clever. It's stone. In Iceland, archaeologists found Viking builders used a 3-layer insulation system, an outer wall of planks or wattle, an inner lining of stone slabs or animal hides, and a middle filled with wool, moss, and animal hair. Gaps were packed with clay to seal draft. In some cases, reflective stones were embedded inside primitive heat mirrors that could bounce warmth back into the room. Outside, the lower half of walls was buried in earth, creating a semi-subterranean effect that absorbed geothermal heat. Snow here was not an enemy. It was insulation. A meter-thick layer of snow on the roof could raise indoor temperatures by nearly a third. Archaeological tests in reconstructed longhouses prove this. What seemed primitive was, in fact, thermal genius. The longhouse did not fight nature. It made an alliance with nature. And the final secret was not made of wood or stone. It was made of flesh. Humans themselves were the longhouse's furnace. Each person generates about 100 watts of heat at rest. Multiply by 40 bodies, add cattle and sheep, and the interior became a living heat engine. The more life inside, the warmer the world. In those winters, community was not merely emotional. It was thermodynamic. This is why Viking society revolved around proximity. The closer you were to others, the closer you were to survival. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, raised above the cold floor, their wooden slats covered in straw and furs. The wealthiest or most respected slept near the central fire. The poor, the slaves, the old near the door. At a glance, you could see the social hierarchy of the Viking world laid out by temperature. Status was not written in gold. It was written in degrees of warmth. Even the air itself was part of the hierarchy. Either of the thick with smoke and heat, belonged to the hanging meats, tools gods carved into beams. Below, humans crouched in the flickering light, wrapped in furs, whispering stories that held their sanity together. The senses would be overwhelmed. The sting of wood smoke, the stench of sweat and manure, the constant drone of animals breathing beside you. The longhouse was not quiet. It was a living organism, snoring, coughing, whispering, creaking through the night as if dreaming with you. Light was precious. Windows were covered with thin sheets of mica or stretched animal intestines, letting in a dull, ghostly glow. After sunset, oil lamps filled with fish oil smoked and sputtered, casting shadows that trembled like ghosts across the walls. In that dim world, a person might grow from November to March without ever seeing true daylight. Privacy did not exist. Birth, death, sex, childbirth, sickness all happened in full view. The longhouse was more than a home. It was society in miniature. Every argument, every reconciliation, every decision about food or firewood was made within arm's reach of 40 others. Conflict had to be managed carefully. In this sealed space, a wrong word could shatter the fragile balance survival depended on. Thus, the Vikings developed what anthropologists call the art of high-minus context communication, the art of understanding without words. A gesture, a silence, a tone carried more meaning than an argument. The sagas are full of traces of this moment where silence itself was strategy, where restraint was survival. In the darkness of the longhouse, words could start wars, but silence could save lives. The longhouse was also a workshop. Winter was not a season of rest. It was a season of creation. Loom weights, bone needles, iron tools, and spindle whorls found in these halls prove that the cold months were when industry flourished. Cloth was woven, weapons repaired, trade goods made ready for spring voyages. Even in confinement, the Vikings remained in motion, turning despair into production. This was survival psychology in its purest form. Idleness was dangerous. It invited the mind to wander into darkness. On the other hand, purpose was heat. The more they worked, the more they belonged. Modern scientists studying polar isolation find the same truth. The Vikings lived by work keeps madness away. When the outside world froze, the Vikings turned inward and built a civilization out of confinement. The longhouse, therefore, was more than timber and smoke. It was a cultural crucible, a womb of endurance reinventing what it meant to be human. Within its walls, they learned the ultimate law of the North: survival was not a condition, it was a craft. And while the fire kept death at bay, another enemy stalked them. Hunger. Food was more than sustenance. It was time itself. Every bite eaten too soon was a day stolen from spring. The old woman's hands moved slowly but precisely, tracing grooves worn into the wooden bowl from decades of use. Her fingers trembled, not from age but from hunger. She measured the day's ration of dried fish and barley by touch alone. She needed no sight. She had performed this ritual more times than she could remember. Around her, the longhouse watched in silence. No one complained. No one dared. The mathematics of survival were sacred, and she was its high priestess. In the Viking world, food was not nourishment. It was time. Every bite measured the distance between life and spring. Reserves had to last until the earth softened and the first shoots appeared again. That could be weeks or months away. Outside, the world offered nothing but snow and silence. Inside, the fate of the community depended on the precision of hands like hers. For the Vikings, food storage was more than a task. It was the religion necessity was built from. So, archaeological finds across Scandinavia reveal the physical remains of this devotion. At Coppergate, in York and Jorvik, excavations revealed enormous storage pits occupying up to a third of household space deep, lined with clay and sealed with wax. These were not cellars. They were vaults guarded as fiercely as treasure hoards. The Norse understood something modern people have forgotten: food is civilization. Without it, loyalty and love collapse. The survival of every settlement was decided not in battle, but in the quiet labor of preserving enough to see another dawn. They used every method nature itself made available. Fish were gutted, split, and hung on wooden racks called Joe, exposed to the icy wind until they became hard as wood. These stock fish were nutritional miracles. Light, dry, able to last for years. Modern tests show some samples still preserved up to 80% of their protein centuries later. For the Norse, this was the perfect food from a world trying to freeze them to death. For the Vikings, stockfish was more precious than gold. It was the currency of survival. Meat followed the same logic, adapted by species. Pork was smoked, its fat sealed into barrels of salt. Beef and mutton were dried in the smoke minus thickened air until leathery and dark. In some longhouses, archaeologists have found animal bones high in the rafters, hung above the hearth where smoke drifted upward day and night. The same smoke that burned their eyes and lungs also preserved their next meal. Fermentation added another layer to this living science. Milk became sky or a yogurt minus like cheese. Thick tangy, rich with protein. Cabbage became Viking minus style sauerkraut, packed in barrels to preserve what little vitamin C they could salvage. Grains were arched and stored dry, safe from mold and insects. Nothing went to waste. Everything became part of the cycle. Even decay was timed. They turned rot into defense. The Norse treated nutrition as a warrior treats strategy. They balanced proteins, fats, and carbohydrates through generations of observation. A handful of stockfish, a bowl of barley porridge, a mouthful of fermented dairy could sustain a grown man for days. This was not culinary pleasure. This was biochemical wisdom encoded in tradition. Archaeological pollen studies reveal the intensity of this agricultural preparation. Fields near settlements were plowed and harvested with military precision. Every grain was part of a social contract. The strong worked to store life for the weak, and in return, the weak endured to carry memory and culture forward. That storing food was only half the battle. The other half was deciding who would eat it. During winter, every meal became a moral test. The sagas hint at this and whispers the unspoken tension at the communal table, where every portion was weighed, not just in size but in justice. The leader had to distribute food based on honor, labor, and necessity. Too much generosity invited death. Too little invited rebellion. Excavations of Viking sites reveal standardized measuring tools, wooden cups, horn spoons, marked bowls specifically for winter rations. These items were not conveniences. They were instruments of order. They prevented jealousy, despair, and chaos from tearing apart what starvation had not yet destroyed. When hunger ruled the North, fairness became a form of weaponry in its own right. The act of distribution itself was ritualized. Anthropologists believe the daily rationing ceremony, where the elder measured and distributed food, served a psychological purpose. By making scarcity predictable, the Vikings made fear bearable. Everyone could see that hunger was equally shared, that no one ate in secret while others starved. In this act, they preserved not only life but trust, the most fragile resource of all. Still, no system was perfect. There were always wares where even the most prepared settlements faced the impossible. Food reserves dwindled before the spring thaw. In those moments, the Vikings turned to what scholars now call famine foods. Bark was stripped from trees and boiled into a bitter paste. Seaweed and lichen were scraped from frozen rocks. Even leather was softened in broth to release a trace of nutrition. Human remains from those winters tell the story in bones and teeth. Signs of starvation, malnutrition, and sheer desperation. When the land turned against them, the Vikings ate the world itself. But famine did more than test the body. It tested the soul. In some places, evidence hints at darker measures. Isotope studies suggest that in desperate years, food was directed toward those most vital to survival: hunters, mothers, warriors. The weak sometimes went hungry so the strong could keep the fire alive. And when even that wasn't enough, the sagas speak in veiled language of the ultimate sacrifice: elders walking into the snow, infants given to the frost. The archaeological evidence from burial sites supports this. Some deaths coincide with severe climate years. The remains bear marks of exposure, not disease. For the Norse, this was not cruelty. It was calculation. They did not believe in endless mercy. They believed in continuance. By losing the few, they saved the many. Survival was not about compassion. It was about continuation. This was not a culture without heart. It was a culture that understood the true price of existence. Even the grim act of selective survival was wrapped in ritual and reverence. Elders who chose death did so with ceremony. Infants lost to the frost were given symbolic burial rites when spring returned. These were not murders. They were negotiations with nature itself. The Vikings also mastered the art of energy conservation, what modern biologists call metabolic management. In the deepest winter months, activity slowed to a crawl. Movements were measured. Speech was sparse. Work was organized around tasks that required the least motion. The sagas describe this as hitting out the dark. It was the discipline of survival. Every unnecessary gesture wasted heat. Every argument wasted breath. Children were taught early to distinguish between discomfort and true danger. To know that endurance was the first rule of life in the North. He did not fight hunger. He befriended it, trained with it, learned its language. The Viking method for preventing starvation was both technological and philosophical. Their granaries, cellars, and smokehouses were survival machines. But their true innovation was psychological. They made hunger sacred. It became part of their identity, a proof of worth. To be able to say, "I endured the long winter," was not a complaint. It was victory. Winter was the enemy that forged their unity. It tested not just their architecture or agriculture, but their very concept of humanity. And when the darkness fell and the reserves were rationed to crumbs, another war began. This time not against cold or hunger, but against the mind itself. The storyteller's voice cuts through the smoke minus thick air, each word like a coal glowing in the gloom. Children press close to the hearth, faces painted in red light and black shadow. Beyond the door lies oblivion, a void without stars, without sound, where even wolves have fallen silent. Inside the circle of fire, reality still exists. In the Viking winter, the hearth was not comfort. It was the edge of existence. Stories were his weapon. As he tells of Thor battling the frost giants, the listeners forget the storm outside. Legends were not just myth. They were medicine. In a world of eternal night, words themselves became fire. Darkness was the North's greatest predator. For months the sun refused to rise, and time itself began to unravel. To north of the Arctic Circle, daylight was only a memory. Even further south, light was thin, a gray bruise in the sky that faded before a man could finish his work. For the mind, this endless twilight was poison, a slow eraser of hope and rhythm. What happens when the mind no longer knows when day begins or ends? Archaeology tells us the Vikings fought back with engineering and ritual. Fire was their primary tool, but it was also their most expensive resource. Every flame cost fuel. Every spark was paid for in sweat. What had to be hauled from frozen forests, dried and guarded like treasure. The longhouse hearth was never allowed to die. Its coals were banked under ash each night, then coaxed back to life at dawn. That continuity of flame meant continuity of life. When archaeologists excavate ancient hearths, they find the same layer of ash, sometimes years, sometimes decades of unbroken fire. It was chosen like medicine: birch for bright light, pine for long heat, alder for slow coals. Each piece served a purpose. Yet, even with perfect management, fire alone could not conquer darkness. It could only carve a small circle of defiance in the dark. To stretch the reach of their light, the Vikings turned to innovation. Soapstone lamps, burned seal or fish oil, their wicks fashioned from twisted moss. They gave off more smoke than glow, but could burn through the night. Some were set into niches lined with polished metal or mica, bouncing light back into the room, primitive mirrors in a world that had never seen glass. They could not summon the sun, so they learned to multiply its ghosts. Candles were luxuries. Beeswax was rare. Tallow candles cost meat and fat better spent on survival. When candles did appear, they marked something sacred: a birth, a ritual, or a night when despair needed to be driven back. For the Norse, light was not a convenience. It was divinity you could hold in your hand. Centuries later, skeletal remains in Viking graves show enlarged eye sockets and increased rod-celled density, signs of adaptation to perpetual demons. Their eyes literally evolved to see in gloom. Pattern experiments prove that after weeks in low-light conditions, human night vision can improve sixfold. Vikings did not fear the dark. They became creatures of it. Their most powerful weapon against darkness was not physical, it was psychological. The sagas, filled with stories, songs, and riddles from the long winters, were not idle entertainments. They were structured therapy sessions for the soul. In the deepest months, the storyteller became a healer, keeping minds from breaking. When you cannot escape the dark, you must learn to make it listen. Every story had a purpose. Some urged journeys to warmer lands, reminding listeners that sunlight still existed. Others told of ancestors who survived worse winters, turning terror into continuity. Storytelling was not escapism, it was survival programming, teaching each listener that endurance had meaning. Rituals provided the calendar the sky had stolen. The Vikings marked time by sound, scent, and memory, the creak of ice, the shifting of the wind, the joy. Feast at the winter solstice. At the turning point of darkness, they did not hide from the night. They confronted it head-on with fire, feast, and song. Archaeologists find traces of those festivals: piles of animal bones, fragments of drinking horns, clusters of lampstones arranged in circular patterns. The people of the north did not wait for light. They made their own, announcing to the void, "We are still here." Every flame lit at Yule was a declaration of war against despair. And meanwhile, the hearth governed both warmth and hierarchy. The closer you sat to the fire, the higher your worth. This was not arrogance. It was survival economics. The leader's family sat at the core, bathed in light. Servants, slaves, and the unwanted huddled near the door, shivering where the cold leaked in. Yet, winter could even reorder the system. When a storyteller lifted morale, when a craftsman kept tools working, when a healer calmed the sick, their value rose. Status could shift by usefulness. In the dark months, skill became nobility. This necessity minus born merit forged a respect for knowledge. An early democracy of endurance. Even a slave who could predict whether might turn us eat near the fire. In the season of darkness, wisdom burned brighter than bloodline. Fire itself took on sacred life. Excavations shows ceremonial hearth maintenance, ashes carefully layered, embers ritually stirred at lunar cycles, charms buried beneath stones. Flame was both technology and spirit, a companion that demanded offerings. When a winter's final coals died, the first spark of spring was struck with ritual silence, as if greeting an old god returned from death. The Vikings did not see light and darkness as opposites. They saw them as partners in a dialogue that shaped their souls. Without darkness, light meant nothing. Without struggle, warmth had no value. Modern life lets us banish the night with a switch. But, in the process, we have forgotten what the Vikings knew: darkness is not the enemy. It is the forge that tempers endurance and creates more. To master winter, the Vikings first mastered themselves. Their command of fire and light bought them another day of life. But outside the longhouse, the cold still reigned. The next battle was fought not with flame, but with fur, leather, and human ingenuity. Their clothing, the invention of a portable fortress. The hunter moves through the trees like a shadow. The air is so cold it quills in his lungs. His breath bursts out in small clouds that freeze before they fade. The snow under his boots cracks, a sound sharper than broken glass. Around him, the forest glitters with frost so fine it looks alive. His face is raw, eyelashes white with ice. Yet, underneath all that cold, he is warm. Vikings didn't just wear clothing, they wore survival. Every layer on his body tells a story of invention. Against his skin is linen, soft and dry, pulling sweat away before it can turn lethal. Over that, a thick woolen tunic traps air, nature's own insulation. Over that, reindeer fur, with its hollow hairs, holds warmth like a living creature. Finally, sealskin, turns snow and water aside. The hunter's garments are not decoration. They are armor against the gods themselves. Archaeologists studying Viking textiles find what modern engineers would call genius. Wool was the foundation, the Viking version of modern performance fabric. But this was no crude material. Under a microscope, Viking wool reveals tightly scaled fibers that interlock when spun, forming tiny air pockets that trap heat. Their sheep were bred for survival. Their wool evolved for insulation. The result was a fabric that stayed warm even when soaked through with melting snow. Before, or -X. And nylon, the North had its own technology. The Vikings didn't just make clothing. They understood the layering system. Their clothing formed a complete ecosystem, a microclimate in dialogue with the body. The linen base layer absorbed sweat and released it quickly, keeping skin dry. The middle wool layer trapped warmth, allowing air to circulate. The outer layer of fur or treated leather sealed out wind and moisture. This was a living microclimate, the difference between life and being found a frozen corpse in spring. Modern field tests using reconstructed Viking clothing prove their mastery. Fully dressed, a Viking could be active for hours at -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, far below the temperature an unprotected human could endure for even minutes. Every material choice carried logic and ritual. Wool was sacred to the goddess, Frigg, protector of home and hearth. Leather was connected to the god, Ulsr, god of hunting and winter. Fur, especially fox or reindeer, were not trophies but talismans infused with the spirit of the animal that had once resisted the cold. Wearing another creature's fur was not vanity. It was a pact with a survivor of nature. Reindeer fur was the jewel of this technology. Its hollow hairs trapped heat so efficiently that centuries later the Sami people still use it for survival. Arctic fox fur, light and soft, lined hoods and collars, protecting the skin from frostbite. Sealskin, damp. Beaver skin, treated with enamel oils, turned water like stone. And wool, ever present, ever adaptable, was spun into endless forms: cloaks, caps, mittens, leggings, even socks. Shoes were marvels of necessity. Archaeologists at Dubai and Elsberger have found reversible leather footwear stitched so they could be worn with either side facing outward. In summer, the smooth grain side faced out to repel water. In winter, the rough flesh side gripped snow and held insulation. Inside, wool wrappings cushioned feet, sometimes stuffed with dry grass for extra warmth. Feet were the first line of defense against frostbite, and the Vikings treated them with reverence. Every step was a negotiation with death. Hands and head came next in the warmth hierarchy. Mittens, not fingered gloves, dominated Viking winter wear, because fingers lose heat more efficiently when kept together. Archaeologists have found layered mittens, inner wool, outer leather, and fur at the wrist. The wrists, rich with blood vessels close to the skin, were guarded like treasure. The same principle shaped their hoods, a tight linen cap under heavy fur, sealing warmth at the neck where blood flow could betray the body's core. For the Vikings, dressing for winter was not a daily task. It was the assembly of ritual armor. Each layer represented foresight, community effort, and ancestral wisdom. A single garment might take days of spinning, weaving, and sewing, often performed collectively. Women, men, even children contributed to the weaving of survival. Textile production was not a gendered chore. It was sacred work. In the dim light of the longhouse, loom weights clinked softly, rhythmic as prayer. Spinning wool was a sign against despair. Every thread was a small rebellion against the cold. The Vikings didn't just weave fabric, they wove courage, and they decorated it, even when beauty had no practical purpose. Intricate borders, colored dyes, and patterns appeared on garments, only to be hidden beneath fur. Tablet woven, trembor protective runes, triangle stitches invoked Thor's hammer or the Valknut, symbol of power and endurance. Even in suffering, they made room for art, because beauty, too, was survival. In a season that stripped the world to black and white, color was defiance. A red cloak, a gold brooch, or a blue dyed thread was not vanity. was psychological warmth, a reminder that life remained vibrant under the snow. Archaeological evidence even shows the Vikings obsessively maintained these clothes. Furs were rain-soiled. Wool was retreated with linseed oil. Seams were mended each winter evening by firelight. The work itself was made visible. The North consumed the careless. Only those who respected their clothing lived to see spring. What is striking about the Viking approach to cold is not just their materials. It is their philosophy. They saw winter not as something to defeat, but as something to collaborate with. They did not curse the cold. They learned its language. Their clothing did not fight nature, it mimicked it. Fur, wool, leather all borrowed the strategies of animals that had already mastered survival. Modern outdoor experts still rely on the same principles the Vikings lived by: layering, insulation, protecting extremities, and letting the body's own heat be the hearth. But for the Norse, this was not theory. It was theology. Warmth itself was sacred, a spark of divine order against the chaos of frost. When the longhouse door opened and the wind howled in, a properly dressed Viking stepped out, not as prey, but as an equal wrapped in layers of craft and meaning. He was part human, part element, a covenant walking the line between life and winter. For the Viking, warmth was not comfort, it was victory. Yet, no matter how perfect their clothes or how clever their fire, survival required something even greater: belief. Because when the body reached its limit, only the mind could keep the spirit from breaking. And in the deepest months of the year, when the sun was dead and the world felt cursed, the Vikings turned to something older and more powerful than any flame: faith. The sea-rest raises her carved staff, its bronze rings chiming softly in the firelight. Around her, the longhouse is silent except for the low moan of wind through the rafters. Her eyes are clouded white, but she sees what others cannot. Smoke rises, curling like spirits above the hearth. The people wait, hollow from hunger, frightened by the sickness creeping through the livestock. They need guidance. They need proof that the gods still listen. In deep winter, faith is not a luxury. It is oxygen. She begins to chant. The sound is not speech, but vibration. Half breath, half thunder. The chant spreads like warmth. Even the children go still. In her voice, the community hears something older than fear. The sea rests as the bridge between worlds. Her words are the only flame bright enough to reach the other side. The Norse did not separate survival from spirituality. For them, the gods were not distant. They lived in the storms, in the frozen rivers under moonlight, in the smoke of the hearth. Every gust of wind was Odin's whisper. Every creaking beam, a spirit's warning. For modern people see weather. Vikings saw will. When the world itself wants you dead, belief becomes the art of negotiation. The concept of fate is not blind destiny, but a web that could be touched, altered, and felt. On the longest nights, they cast runes, read bones, sought patterns in flames. Archaeologists have found runestone nests marked with mid-winter dates, used to predict when the sun would return. Each reading was not prophecy, it was psychology. By giving uncertainty a form, they made fear manageable. Winter for the Norse was the season when boundaries between worlds thinned. The dead walked closer, the gods listened more keenly, and the living learned humility. Excavations at Harshest in Iceland have uncovered winter-specific ritual spaces, altars surrounded by animal bones and carved idols blackened by soot. This was not ordinary religion. It was survival magic written in blood and smoke. They did not pray for comfort. They bargained for existence. During these ceremonies, the sea rest was not a performer. He was an instrument. The rhythmic chant, the flicker of firelight, the scent of burning herbs all worked together to alter consciousness, heal hunger. Neuroscience confirms what the Norse knew instinctively: rhythm and repetition can change brain states, dull hunger, and even reduce pain. Their magic was not illusion. It was early psychology. And at the center of the psychological defense stood a single celebration: the winter solstice, the longest night, the turning point when darkness swallowed almost everything, held back only by belief. When the sun vanished, the Vikings threw a feast for the dark. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of ash and bone from Yule feasts, evidence of slaughter, sacrifice, and unrestrained consumption. That night, rationing laws broke, fires blazed brighter, meat flowed. The people of the North defied despair by acting as if plenty still existed. To modern eyes, this might seem reckless, but to them, it was medicine. They believed generosity summoned the returning light. Light, food, laughter each became a weapon against despair. Every torch lit at Yule was a promise the sun would rise again. When the sky outside remained black, the Vikings built suns of their own. Their festivals were not celebrations. They were counterattacks. Personal faith also took on winter form. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer appear with increased frequency in the coldest months, as did charms for the goddess Sky of winter in the hunt. These were not superstitious trinkets. They were archaeological anchors, tangible proof that protection still existed. Excavations of sacrificial sites show that during winter, offerings became more personal. A silver ring, a child's carved toy, a rare piece of meat. To give away value in a time of scarcity was not madness. It was defiance. It restored control. In the transaction with the divine, fear became a choice. In the darkest moments, the Vikings found strength in surrender. Spiritual specialists, like the sea rest, raveled between settlements through snow and ice, carrying not just prophecy but morale. Their presence reminded that meaning still connected scattered communities. The burials of these women reveal staffs scabbed with iron, pouches of herbs, and fragments of amber objects believed to trap light itself. They were the doorkeepers in a world of shadow. Death was ever near in winter, but it did not end participation. The Vikings believed ancestors remained close, watching and guiding. Their spirits could bless or punish depending on how the living behaved. Many families kept ancestor stones or wooden effigies near the hearth, feeding them a share of food each night. To neglect them was to invite famine. Even in a land of hunger, the dead had to be fed. This relationship with the unseen turned grief into structure. If someone died in winter, the body might wait months for burial, but their spirit was immediately woven into the community's defense. The border between the living and the dead was a conversation, not a wall. These rituals served more than faith. They preserved mental health. Modern studies of isolated communities confirm what the Norse practiced: shared ceremonies reduce anxiety, create cohesion, and replace chaos with pattern. Their myths and magic were not primitive. They were numerical warfare against despair. When the sun finally returned in late winter, it was met not with surprise but triumph. The community had kept their side of the bargain. Through ritual restraint and shared purpose, they had kept the world turning. The light did not save them. They saved the light. The spiritual endurance of the Vikings was not blind belief. It was a strategy. They learned that meaning could warm what fire could not. In that truth lay the secret of their survival. When the body faltered, faith carried what flesh could not bear. Yet, even faith had limits. The gods could not thaw frozen ground or lighten the weight of death that winter always demanded. The next task would be the cruelest facing. Loss on land too hard to bury the dead. Fire could comfort the living, but who would comfort the frozen dead? The hammer strikes once, dull against ice minus hard earth. The sound does not echo. It vanishes, swallowed by snow. A small group stands around the pit, wrapped in furs stiff with frost. Their breath rises like ghosts. At their feet, a body lies sewn into a shroud of wool and hide. Its eyelashes are rimmed with frost, hair glazed with ice. The priest murmurs the final verses, voice trembling from cold more than grief. In Viking lands, even death had to wait its turn. The ground was iron, the blade no spade. No one could break it. So, the dead remained above ground, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, until spring returned. They rested in barns, outbuildings, and small huts later known as dead houses. Archaeologists uncover them near Icelandic farms, crude log shelters sealed with turf, lined inside with straw. Inside, the silence is absolute. The living visit daily, lighting oil lamps to keep frost from consuming the faces of those they loved. They speak to the dead as if they still listen, and perhaps they believe they did. When you cannot bury the body, you keep talking to the soul. This grim arrangement served both practical and spiritual purposes. Frozen soil made burial impossible, but it also created time to say goodbye, to arrange the rites properly, to ensure the spirit crossed safely into the next world. The Vikings believed that if a corpse was neglected, its soul might wander restless, cold, and angry. These, Dr. Augustin, the undead of Norse legend, were not imaginary monsters. They were warnings born from winter itself. Every unburied body was a potential haunting, so care was sacred. The dead were washed with melted snow, wrapped in clean cloth, adorned with small possessions: a comb, a brooch, a knife. Wealth did not matter. Recognition did. Even in poverty, the dead were treated with ceremony because ritual gave shape to grief. Death without ritual was more terrifying than death itself. Archaeological evidence supports these acts of devotion. At Burka, Hund, Asperger, researchers have found preserved flowers placed beside the dead yarrow, wormwood, meadows, frozen fragments of color in a monochrome world. These were not decorations. They were prayers in plant form, symbols of rebirth waiting beneath the snow. Yet, some winters overwhelmed even ritual. In famine years, when bodies outnumbered places to keep them, the Vikings turned to the sea. A funeral ship might be dragged under frozen water and set aflame when the ice allowed. Names reflected on the fjord like a second sun. Such scenes echo through sagas and modern archaeology like ashes mingled with charred wood scattered across coastal grave sites. When the earth refused the dead, the sea became their coffin. A symbolism runs deep. The sea was the pathway to every other world, Midgard to Asgard, life to death. Returning a body to the waves was not surrender, it was release. The ocean that sustained them in life would carry them safely into myth. But for most, death was quieter. Families kept vigil beside the body through long nights, telling stories that folded the dead back into the living. Grief was never private. It was shared, guided by narrative. To forget the dead was to weaken the community's spine. Every name repeated in firelight became a form of immortality. When spring finally came, burial began. Men swung axes to break the softened crust. Women gathered offerings, food, jewelry, the first green shoots. The grave itself was a conversation between permanence and mercy. In Norway, burial mounds rise in the landscape like frozen waves, each marking a human life that refused to vanish. Their cemeteries were not fields of sorrow. They were maps of endurance. Some graves were aligned to the sunrise, awaiting light's return. Others faced the west, the unseen realm of the dead. The Vikings buried their people not to separate them, but to station them as guardians, as witnesses, as proof that survival was possible. The soil they entered was not enemy ground, but ancestral memory, the same dirt their descendants would one day fight to live upon. Inside these graves, archaeologists find weapons and tools, spindle whorls, fragments of fur and wool. Every object was chosen with precision, a final dialogue between the living and the departed. You fought, you built, you endured. Take these, and continue your work. And perhaps the most haunting detail is what they sometimes buried last: a burning coal placed near the chest, a spark offered from the hearth minus fire, so the dead would not enter the next world cold. Even at the end, they refused to let their dead freeze. The Norse understanding of mortality was not despair. It was discipline. Death was inevitable, but neglect was a sin. By caring for the dead, they reaffirmed life. Every burial, every mound, every flame on frozen ground was a declaration: we remember, therefore we endure. As winter wore on, every grave mound under the snow became both a warning and a promise. Beneath lay those who had earned their rest. Above trudged those yet to. In that tension, in the dialogue between living warmth and frozen silence, lies the essence of the Viking soul. In a land that could kill them at any moment, the Vikings learned to bury fear before they buried their dead. And still one more trial remained, the hardest of all, because when the dead were honored, The food gone, the flames burning low, the wind screaming across the fjords. The living had to decide which among them would see the next sunrise. The fire burns low, an orange eye staring out from the hearth. Around it, the longhouse breathes like a sleeping beast, slow, heavy, exhausted. Every creak of timber sounds like a groan from the earth itself. In one corner, a mother hums softly to a child wrapped in woolen fur. The lullaby is not sweet. It is a warding spell. The lyrics promise nothing except endurance. In the Viking winter, love was not gentle. It was ruthless. To bring a child into that world was an act of courage and calculation. Life itself was a gamble with the elements. Babies were born in the same smoky halls where animals slept and elders coughed. A sterile quiet, only fire, blood, and breath steaming in the cold air. A newborn's first sound was not always a cry. Sometimes it was violent, and winter's silence was a decision. Survival began with the smallest heartbeat, and sometimes ended before it began. The saga's whisper of exposure, the leaving of unwanted or doomed infants. In the old Norse mind, this was not murder. It was release, a grim equation written in frost. Archaeological stratum and saga accounts suggest that when food failed or deformity threatened survival, the weak were returned to the earth. Old women said their souls would find quicker rebirth in warmer times. Modern judgment cannot touch this truth without misunderstanding it. These people were not monsters, but pragmatists in a world that punished mercy. For the Vikings, compassion was not measured in sentiment. It was measured in endurance. The family that perished helping a fragile life saved no one. It doomed them all. In the North, mercy could kill faster than the cold. Yet, the infants who survived infancy were treated as miracles. Childhood in the Viking Age was brief, but burned bright. From the time they could walk, children became workers hauling wood, feeding livestock, spinning wool, fetching water through snow tunnels taller than themselves. They existed, but play was training. Wooden swords, toy long ships, carved animals. Each was a lesson in strength, precision, or the art of endurance. Archaeologists have found miniature tools and child-sized axes buried near settlements, not as toys but as symbols. Even the smallest hands were expected to carry the weight of survival. Every child was both a burden and a promise, a living investment in the next spring. In the Viking world, innocence froze first. Elders faced the opposite end of the same brutal spectrum. In youth, strength was the goal. In age, weakness was the danger. There was no retirement. In the North, every mouth had to earn its share. As long as elders could mend nets, weave rope, or tell stories that steadied hides, they were precious. But when illness or frailty made even that impossible, a dark choice loomed. The sagas and oral legends preserve whispers of old men walking into the snow, of widows leaving the longhouse before dawn. This act was cold. Going into the cold was not forced exile, but a voluntary farewell. The belief was that by willingly returning one's life to the frost, the gods would spare the family the curse of starvation. Choosing death was turning death into a final act of love. Archaeological evidence supports some of these stories. At several Norse sites, the skeletons of elders have been found in shallow graves far from main burial grounds. Their postures are peaceful, unguarded. No signs of violence, only solitude. The sagas called them heroes of the quiet kind, those who met the cold so others didn't have to. The psychology behind these customs was not cruelty. It was consistency. Everyone in the longhouse understood their place in the grand arithmetic of survival. Death was not always a tragedy. Sometimes it was duty. Yet, the emotional cost ran deep. Songs from Iceland in later centuries preserve laments of daughters dreaming of mothers standing in the snow with open arms. Even acceptance could not erase grief. They learned to honor sorrow without letting it weaken them. Inside the longhouse, respect for age remained profound. Elders were the keepers of memory, the living libraries of knowledge. They carried the oral history, whether patterns, medicinal recipes, and the stories of gods that had held the community together for generations. Even if their bodies failed, their voices fed the tribe. To lose them before they passed on their wisdom was a disaster. This is why winter nights became classrooms. Children gathered around the hearth, listening to stories that mixed myth and manual how to read ice conditions, when to sow barley, what herbs to boil for fever. These stories were not fiction. They were survival manuals disguised as poetry. In the darkness, words became inheritance. The generational bond was the secret infrastructure of Viking life. The young provided strength. The old provided reason. Both were needed to endure what no individual could face alone. When one fell, the other carried the flame. And that flame was literal. An elder's final duty was oft untending the hearth, the last act of warmth they still controlled. When they died, another took their place at the fire, ensuring the cycle never broke. Life in the North was a relay, not a race. The price of survival was constant sacrifice, but it also produced something rare as solidarity born not from comfort, but from shared struggle. In the Viking world, every breath taken in winter was an act of cooperation across generations. Thus, when a child survived its first year, when an elder saw one more sunrise, it was not chance. It was the result of hundreds of small decisions by a tribe that refused to break. Their strength was never individual. It was inherited, shared, and renewed every time the longhouse fire refused to die. But beyond the labor, beyond the rituals, and beyond the sacrifices, something even greater was keeping them alive. The mind itself, because in the end, no fire or fire could save a person whose spirit had already frozen. Storm outside never ends. It howls like something alive, pressing its cold mouth against the wooden walls. Inside the longhouse is nearly silent. The fire has burned down to coals. Faces glow red in the dimness. No one speaks, but everyone listens. To the wind, to their own thoughts, to the thin thread of sanity stretched between them. The greatest enemy of the Viking winter was not the cold. It was the mind. The cold killed the body slowly, but despair killed it faster. The Vikings knew this long before science gave it an aim. They lived in a world that tested not just the strength of flesh, but the architecture of the human spirit. Their psychology was their shield. Austrian researchers studying polar explorers, soldiers, and isolated communities find what the Norse lived by instinct endurance is a mental art. The body endures what the mind accepts. When scarcity becomes routine, the only way to survive is to reshape the meaning of suffering. The Vikings did not escape hardship. They redefined it. From birth, they were trained to see pain not as punishment, but as proof. Cold was not a curse. It was the teacher of resilience. Hunger was not failure. It was the measure of strength. Every ordeal became an opportunity to prove worth, both to oneself and to the gods. The sagas reflect this mental conditioning. Heroes rarely cry out in agony. Instead, they describe their suffering with dark humor as silence. To modern ears, this sounds stoic, but to the Norse, it was sacred. Control over one's reaction to pain was a form of power. If you could not master the world, you could still master yourself. For the Viking, silence was not weakness. It was dominance over despair. Anthropologists call this mindset adaptive fatalism. The Norse believed fate was woven before birth, but within that pattern lay freedom, the freedom to choose how to face what was coming. That single choice of response was the root of dignity. One saga says, "We cannot change our doom, but we can meet it laughing." Their laughter was not joy. It was rebellion. It was a psychological weapon, turning fear into drama, misfortune into story. This is why even their myths mirror resilience. Gods destined to die at Ragnarok fight anyway. Existence itself is resistance. The Norse did not believe in happy endings. They believed in worthy battles. This worldview created astonishing mental endurance. Archaeological evidence shows entire communities rebuilt after fires, famines, or floods, often in the same place as if daring the gods to strike again. Their resilience was physical, but it began in the mind, a refusal to give nature the satisfaction of their despair. Inside the longhouse, this mindset was shaped through ritual and repetition. Every winter morning began the same way, tending the fire, counting rations, checking the livestock. Routine became religion. Psychologists today know that structure prevents mental collapse and isolation. The Vikings lived that truth. Order was their therapy, and when structure failed, stories took its place. Every saga told by firelight, every myth, was a form of cognitive endurance. Stories reminded them that others had faced the same horrors and lived to tell them. In the retelling, trauma became legacy. A people who could turn suffering into a story could never be truly conquered. They also understood community psychology better than most modern societies. In the longhouse, despair was contagious, but so was courage. If one person panicked, the rest might falter. If one person steadied themselves, others found their rhythm again. Survival was emotional teamwork. This is why leadership in the Viking world wasn't defined only by strength but by calm. A chieftain was expected to remain composed even when disaster struck. His steadiness was more valuable than his sword. In this sense, Viking leadership was archetypal psychology, the ability to regulate the emotions of an entire group through demeanor, tone, and restraint. The calmest person in a storm became the tribe's anchor. Modern neuroscience confirms what the Vikings practiced intuitively. Emotion regulates endurance. When fear takes over, blood flows from the brain to the muscles. Decision-making collapses. But when calm prevails, even limited resources feel sufficient. The Viking belief in fate paradoxically reduced fear. If fate was already written, panic served no purpose. Only action counted. This belief gave them clarity in chaos. When a long ship broke under waves or a roof sagged under snow, there was no frenzy, only movement. Acceptance sharpened focus. The Norse did not waste energy on the impossible. They worked with what remained. Acceptance, not optimism, was their secret strength. And beneath that acceptance flowed something deeper. Meaning, every hardship, no matter how cruel, was part of a story that mattered. The universe itself had purpose, even if it ended in fire and frost. This belief made even suffering bearable because it was never meaningless. Modern psychologists who study resilience call this logotherapy, finding purpose in suffering. Viktor Frankl would describe its entries later. The Vikings practiced it 1,000 years before. Their lives proved that meaning does not erase suffering. It turns pain into direction. In that transformation lay their greatness. They conquered the world not because they were stronger or crueler. They conquered it because they were trained to endure what others couldn't imagine. The body would break. The mind decided when. And spring finally came. What filled their hearts was not joy. It was the survivors emerged from the longhouse, blinking in the first sunlight, gaunt but alive, their eyes carrying the fire. They had stared into the abyss and refused to vanish. Their minds had become as tempered as their swords, shaped by the cold, hammered by fear, honed by repetition, and finally cooled in silence. To live through a Viking winter was to undergo a psychological forging. The weak metal of comfort was burned away, leaving only steel. And that steel would soon cross oceans, build kingdoms, and carve its name into history. They did not merely survive winter. They became the weapon it forged. Because endurance was never the absence of suffering. It was the mastery of suffering. The Vikings learned the North oldest lesson: true strength comes not from the body or the gods. It comes from within. And for those who lived through the endless dark, every heartbeat, every flame, every breath of spring air was proof of an eternal truth. The greatest victory lies not in conquering the world, but in surviving it. Spring did not arrive in the North. It slowly returned, like a promise hesitantly kept. The snows often first in silence. Breaths broke with groans like ancient doors reopening. The air tasted different, carrying the faint scent of soil instead of iron. After months of monochrome, color bled back into the world: green, gold, the impossible blue of open sky. The survivors emerging from the longhouse had lean faces, scarred hands, unreadable eyes. They blinked in the sunlight as if seeing it for the first time. The light felt wrong, too bright, too loud. But then the warmth hit their skin, and a deep, almost animal joy rose from their chests. They had done it. After half a year of darkness, the miracle wasn't that they were alive. It was that they had never stopped believing they could be. The first tasks of spring were not celebrations. They were resurrections. Fires were lit. Tools were mended. Graves were finished. Longhouse doors flung wide, letting in fresh air that smelled like forgiveness. Everywhere life began again, but slower, wiser, humbler. Those who had endured the winter were not the same people who had entered it. The cold had scraped away vanity and delusion. In its place stood something raw and honest, a mind that had met its own edge and stepped beyond. To survive the Viking winter was to meet yourself and not look away. Archaeologists can still trace the rhythm of those winters in soil layers and bone chemistry. But what they cannot measure is the transformation inside each human being, the invisible inheritance of resilience passed down through centuries. He still carry fragments of it, the instinct to prepare, to hoard, to light a candle in the dark. All are echoes of that ancient war between warmth and oblivion. Modern life has softened us. We fear discomfort as our ancestors feared famine. Yet, somewhere beneath the convenience and electricity, the same capacity remains: the will to endure. The Vikings remind us that what makes us human is not comfort, it is struggle. We are all descendants of people who refused to die in the dark. When we look back at their world, its brutality, its hunger, its endless night, it is easy to feel distance. But look closer, and you see a mirror. The fears are the same, only colder. The courage is the same, only quieter. What they faced with fire and faith, we now face with anxiety and doubt. The conditions have changed, but the battle remains. Though their story is not just history, it is a guide. The Vikings did not conquer winter through brute force. They conquered it through meaning. They understood that endurance isn't just about the body's strength, but the soul's purpose. Every night survived had to matter. Every dawn had to justify the suffering. Survival without purpose was just a slower dying. If we could take one lesson from their world to ours, it is this: comfort is temporary. Resilience is eternal. You don't need to live through a blizzard to understand their wisdom. You only need to face your own darkness with the same resolve. Because in every life, there comes a wintry moment when warmth seems to vanish. The world feels silent, and survival becomes a question of will. When that moment arrives, remember the people of the North. Remember the smoke, the cold, the endless night, and the fire that never went out. They did not merely survive history's harshest winters. They became the warmth that carried humanity through it. The Viking story is not about conquest. It is about endurance, about the quiet, stubborn miracle of life refusing to end. And in that defiance, in that shared human heartbeat across 1,000 years, lies our truest kinship with them.